Hi, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue book. It just happens to be Little Blue book number 594. And it is titled The Overman, written by Upton Sinclair. And let's see if there's a copyright date. I don't think there is, but, oh yes there is, I remember now. Hold on. There's several. But the one for this is copyright 1924. And this is part 2. So, we'll get to part 2 in a moment. Okay, and here we go. Part 2 of The Overman by Upton Sinclair. I gave the balance of the day to a preliminary ransacking of the island. A scientist has an inexhaustible mind of interest in such an environment, and in the plans which I formed for work, I forgot everything else for the time. And so towards sundown I returned to the cabin. My brother was still pacing to and fro, exactly as I had left him. Taught by previous experience, I entered the cabin without addressing him, and set about preparing a meal. I had not gone very far before I heard his step behind me. "Edward," he said. "What is it?" I asked, turning. "I wished merely to tell you that you will not see me for a day or two. I wished you not to worry about me." I gazed at him in perplexity. That was too great to permit of my framing a question. His haggard glance met mine again, and again he put his hand upon my shoulder with a gesture of affection. Then he turned and went slowly away. The incident diminished my appetite, for I had expected to interest him in my banquet. I sat for hours afterwards, gazing out of the cavern entrance at the moonlighted grove, silent and desolate beyond any telling. I think I never felt more alone than just then. The problem was my only company. I had no idea where Daniel had gone. But after a feverish sleep, I was up again at dawn, my mind fully made up for a search. I fear I drag out my story. It was nearly sundown when at last my efforts were rewarded. I was returning home in despair and misery when, suddenly in the back of the same cliffs in which was our home, I saw another opening. And with a gleam of hope I hurried towards it and peered in. It was too dark to see, but I entered and stepped to one side in the darkness, and then, as my eyes adjusted themselves to the gloom, I saw my brother. I was unperceived, and I went forward until I could see him plainly. He sat upon a block of stone, the edge of which his hands gripped tensely. With his face slightly raised, he was staring before him into space. I would describe, if I could, the impression which his whole appearance gave me. It was of a man undergoing some fearful strain. The knotted muscles stood out upon his arms. His nostrils were distended, his breath coming fast, and I could see the veins throbbing in his forehead. I stood for I know not how long, with my heart beating madly, a strange, indescribable fear in possession of me. Divining the truth instinctively, I moved in front of him and gazed into his eyes. He neither saw me nor heard me, nor gave any sign that he was conscious of my presence. Then suddenly, unable to bear this strain any longer, I clutched him in my arms, crying wildly, "Daniel! Daniel!" To my horror, he gave no signs. Even then I clung to him. I shook him. I could feel the quivering of his tense arms. At last, completely overcome, I turned and staggered from the place. All that night I lay stretched out upon the bed, sleepless. I had studied medicine, but nothing that I had ever heard of bore any resemblance to this. Perhaps 2 hours after sunrise, as I was sitting with my eyes fixed in the direction of the other cavern, all at once I saw my brother appear. I sprang up in sheer fright. He was pale beyond imagination. He paid no attention to me, but went past me and entered the cave. He groped his way to his larder and, sinking down upon the ground, took some of the food and ate it slowly. There was a bowl of milk which I had put there, and which he drank. Then he lay down, resting his head upon his arm, and fell fast asleep. I followed him in silence. When he arose, his weakness apparently gone. He went to the spring which was near the cavern and bathed his face and arms in the stream below it. After that he came towards me and, sitting down beside me, put his arms around me. "Dear brother," he said, "it was very good of you, but please do not do what you did again." "You knew that I was there," I cried. "Yes," he said, "I knew it." "And why did you not answer me?" "I could not answer you, brother." And then with a sudden gesture he checked me. "I could not even tell you why," he said. "It must suffice you, Edward, to know that this must be, and that you cannot help it." "But it will kill me," I cried. "Perhaps," he said very quietly, "or perhaps it will kill me first. I cannot tell." We stood for some minutes without speaking. "Daniel," I ventured at last, "I had hoped that in the external ways I might assist you. Your food, perhaps?" "I could not let you serve me," he answered. "I have no way to serve you in return. And, besides that, I have learned to do cheerfully what little physical toil I must. The island is covered with food, you know." "But if you should be sick?" I cried. "If I should be sick," he said, "I should either get well again or else die." "Then you do not feel pain?" "To learn to bear pain has been one of my tasks," was the response. "I should think," he continued, changing the subject abruptly, "that if you had studied all your life as you did when we lived together, by this time you would not fear solitude, that you would find in this new world enough to fill all your time." "I might. Perhaps I shall," I said. "But, Daniel, you have been here 20 years and never seen a ship. So how could I know that the result of any studies of mine would ever be made known to the world? I have not even any paper to write upon." The other sat gazing ahead of him at the moonlit water through the trees. I saw the strange smile upon the lips again. "All that sorrow," he said, "I fought with it once myself, and how I wish that I could help you to fight with it. For a year or so I also waited for a ship, and wrote down the best of my music and poured out the tears of my soul. But, Edward, I no longer write my music, and I no longer fear lest my work be not made known to the world." His voice had sunk low. Over the treetops a silver moon was gleaming, and his eyes were fixed upon it, on that huge ball of iron and rock. Said he, "There was once power and life and beauty, and now it rolls there, through the years and the ages, cold and dead and still. And some day this planet, too, will roll through the years and the ages, and no eye will behold it, and no mind will be aware of it. And the voices of men will be hushed upon it, and the monuments of men will be dust upon it. And, Edward, what then of my music? What then of your science and your books?" I answered nothing. Perhaps in all the ages that have turning page. Pardon me. "Perhaps all the ages have gone over this island," he continued. "No human foot ever trod upon it before." And so my brother passed on, pressing his hand upon my shoulder, and through the watches of the night I saw him pacing backward and forward upon the long white stretch of sand. A month must have passed after that. I took little heed of the time. I toiled at the cave, I played hunter and naturalist. I was busy with my hands, but very seldom was I happy or at peace. For day after day that silent figure roamed here and there before my eyes, and hour after hour those strange silent vigils to the black cavern continued. I grew more and more restless and oppressed, until at last, one night, at the end of a long and exhausting vigil, my impatience reached its climax. I remember how I sat by his side and caught his hand like a supplicating child. "Daniel," I asked, "has it never occurred to you that you are unkind to me?" "Unkind?" he asked gently. "Unkind," I said. "I have waited. How long have I waited? It seemed to me that it could have not last forever, that you would not continue to treat me always as if I were a child." "Edward," he said, "I know what you are going to say. I wish that you would spare me." "I cannot spare you," I cried, with sudden vehemence. "I tell you I cannot bear it. I tell you I shall go mad. This loneliness and this haunting perplexity, I swear to you that I cannot endure it any longer." My brother sat gazing before him. After a moment, I went on, more quietly, pleading with him. "Daniel," I said, "you cannot ever persuade me that you must needs treat me as you have treated me since I came to this place. I came here to speak for you, for that purpose, alone, and with love in my heart, and you keep me from you. You treat me as if I were not a human being." "Stop, Edward," cried my brother imploringly. "Do not say such things as that." "Ah, what can I tell you? How can I say it to you? It is not enough that you should be a human being." "Not enough," I echoed. Do you suppose, can you suppose, that if this thing of which we speak were mine to give, if by losing it myself I could give it to you, can you suppose I would not do it, and do it with joy? All that love could make possible I would do. How much I would do I cannot tell you. But this that you ask of me, this I cannot do." "You mean," I clung to the argument with my scientific instinct, "you mean that there is in your own life, your own mind, certain things which could be conveyed to another's?" "I do," he said. "But the use of words," I began. "No words could have any relation to this," he said. "But ideas, Daniel," I protested. "There may be ideas in the mind for which we can find no words, but surely we can approximate them. We can foreshadow them." "There are some things in my mind that are not ideas," was the quick reply. "I do not understand that," I exclaimed. "I know it," said my brother. "That is the point." "But," I cried in vexation, "but what could such things be? How can one think—" "In that high hour, thought was not," my brother quoted. I sat silent, and a long pause followed. Then I began once more. "Let me ask you, Daniel, perhaps you do not understand how difficult it is for one mind to believe that it cannot grasp what is—" turning the page, "what is in another mind. But this knowledge to which you have come, you must surely have come to it by degrees, by a process." "Yes," he said. "And of that, surely you could explain to me at least the beginning, which might help me to divine in what the difference consists." He answered nothing for a moment. I went on quickly. "I fear that there must be another reason that you do not realize. Might it not be true that you would find it easier to explain to another than to me? Is it not at all that you shrink from my way of thinking? Is it not that you know that I have never understood your art? Tell me," he asked suddenly, "what have you thought about me since you have been here?" "What difference does it make what I think?" I cried. "What data have I for thinking anything?" I know that I am in the presence of something which haunts me, and also that I have never been more wretched in my life. Ah, Daniel, I cried, be fair with me. You have not been fair. Why should you shrink from me as if I were a base person? What harm could it do, even if I did not understand you? I cannot help it. The effect of this thing upon me, I am a grown man, and yet you have turned me into a child again. If you were to tell me about ghosts, I think I should take it for the truth. Huh? Said my brother. Yes, even that, I cried. But you think I am not worthy even to guess at your life and your knowledge. No, do not try to stop me. I know that this is the fact. If it were not so, you would trust to love. You would not cast me away from you. You would do what you could. Be still, he whispered. Do not speak to me that way. I will. That's not the page. Where is it? I will. One page, there we go. I will do what I can. I will tell you what I am able. For a long time he sat with knit brows. Then at last he began his story. I go back, he said, to the time when I first landed on this island. The ship was wrecked upon the bar just ahead of us, and later, when the sea fell, we set to work to save from it as much as we could. The voyage had restored my health, and I had my violin, and when I ascertained that the place sheltered no wild beasts or men, I was myself well content to remain as long as might be necessary. I had no doubt that some ship would appear in the end, and meanwhile there was nothing to trouble me, except the enforced companionship of men who did not understand me. In the end, I escaped from that trouble with the plea that if I took up my residence at the other side of the island, I could better watch the sea. And so I built a tiny hut, and was, I think, as happy as I had ever been before. But as the months passed by and no vessel appeared, the situation changed. I perceived that sooner or later my violin would be useless, and about the same time the sailors came to me to say that they had decided to rig a boat with a sail and endeavor to reach some inhabited island. It was the time of quiet seas, and they preferred to run the risk of remaining longer in isolation. I was then called upon to make the great decision. Should I change my life with the rest, or should I trust to the certainty that some day a vessel would appear, and meanwhile devote myself to the work which loomed before me, the living of my life, the seeking of the power which I felt to be hidden in me, without any external assistance or reference whatsoever? Perhaps I'll get the page turned. There it is. Perhaps, had I seen the 20 years before me, I should have shrunk from the task. But, as it was, I chose what was to be the bolder, to my companions the more timid course. After that, of course, there could be no halfway measures. I had to make good my purpose. I had to face either absolute victory or absolute defeat. As I had expected, my violin soon became useless, and no ship appearing, I perceived in the end that I had to give up that thought too. I have already hinted the grounds of my argument to you. It is my belief that life is in its own end, and needs no justification. It is also my belief that each individual soul is a microcosm, self-sufficient, and its own excuse for being. Each day, as I wrought, I came to be more and more possessed with that truth. It came to be more and more self-evident and final, until at last there came a day when I would not have hailed a ship had I seen one. When the life that loomed up before me within my own heart was a thing of so much interest that the rest of the world was nothing in comparison. At first, I had felt just as you feel now. I had been interested in food and clothing and light and what not else. But in the end, I found myself behaving as a soldier upon a long campaign. I strewed my path with the things that had once been necessities, and that now were encumbrances. It proved thus with my violin strings and the music that throbbed in my soul and swept me away in the fierce spaces of my being. It was no longer to be limited and restrained by what human fingers could achieve. It was as if I had once plodded upon the land and now discovered wings. When the vision came to me, I no longer toiled for weeks to shape it and record it. I went on where my new light shone. Where the new hope beckoned. And so, day after day, toward things with which it is not easy for words to deal. My brother paused for a while. I did not speak. And I think we'll stop there. And that'll be the end of part 2 of The Overman by Upton Sinclair, book number 594 of the Little Blue Book series. I'm Dean Shunkwaller, and thanks for joining me on my podcast and YouTube channel. We'll see you here in part 3.